That's cool. Okay, so obviously the chapter is about diversity and differences in the classroom. So that's kind of what we're going to go over chapter wise. Again, I don't thoroughly agree with everything that's in the chapter, so I'm going to chime in from my own experiences, my own perspectives in the profession. So this is just the outline view of what we go over in the chapter, so we're going to dive right in. So today's diverse classroom, aspects of diversity that affect teaching and learning. So we talk about social class, race, ethnicity, and gender, and then they go on to define each of those. And it's more nebulous than it at first appears, or perhaps that you've been brought up in. So social class, we have kind of a dichotomy in social class in different countries. So for instance, in Brazil, you have very low income people and you have high income. So there's a huge disparity between the two classes. In the US and in Great Britain, there's more of a range of class. So you have that middle class, you have upper middle class, lower middle class, etc. That's been defined mostly through the 20th century. So we talk about culture being a broad definition of culture. So the idea is that people are sharing things like knowledge, values, attitudes, traditions that guide the behavior of that group of people. Now, again, that's not a one-size-fits-all disclaimer, because then that goes into the whole aspect that's discussed in the chapter on stereotyping and the negative effects that go into trying to live up to that stereotype or trying to deny that stereotype that goes with whatever culture, race, ethnicity, etc. There are differences in regions, so I would point to you in your own beliefs of what people are like in the northern states versus the southern states in the United States, because there's a certain disparity there of what people believe the other group is like, especially if you live in one and you've never lived in the other. Again, there's also variations on ethnicity. So we can't say that all people that are, say, Jewish share exactly the same beliefs. Some stay kosher, some don't stay kosher. Some are Orthodox, some are non-Orthodox. So we do have a variation within subgroups, so that's something you need to be aware of. And then we go on to things like racial, but what happens if, like my own children, if your children are biracial? Will they identify as Caucasian, or will they identify as Latino, or both, given the opportunity and exposure to identify as both? Gender, also, we have variations. So kids are now very early on identifying as transgender. My little cousin is one of those who self-identified before she hit puberty as transgender, and she has since changed her name and identifies with being a male. Individuals are also members of many groups at the same time. So I can be, I can be American, and I can be Catholic, and I can also be Latino. So there are many ways of mapping that out in a Venn diagram, which you see the overlap of different traits, because that's really what we are: traits, beliefs, etc., that make up culture. Examples of one individual's cultural ties, well, I kind of just did that for you with the example that I just gave. So, American cultural diversity. So there's many different cultures within every modern society. Okay, so I'll point to Brazil again. So Brazil, in the city of São Paulo, they perhaps have the largest immigrant Japanese population, I think, in the world. Or at least in North and South America, at least in this part of the hemisphere. So most people don't realize that. They don't have a realization that a lot of Brazilians, their first language that they grow up in is actually Japanese, especially in that city. I mean, it doesn't really go elsewhere. But that was an impact of immigration at one specific window of time. So we have situations like that. But we have also microcosms, like, so for instance, we have rural versus town, we have suburban versus urban, um, the store clerk versus the doctor. And all of these kids can be in the same room depending on the locale of your school and what you're serving. Curriculum, though, should have a baseline that everybody gets included. So that's really kind of where we're going with this discussion of how we make adaptations to instruction to best serve, again, the largest possible audience. So as a technical or technology intervention that I'm particularly fond of, if you happen to have a student in class that's well traveled, and then you have a student in class that's not well traveled, so somebody that's never been out of the county and somebody that's been in several different countries. So then we talk about some particular aspect of the world or reality at that given time, curriculum. How do you get those two people and those perspectives on the same common ground? Simply put, the best way to do that is give them a stimulus that's common. So traditionally we've used textbooks, but they're both going to interpret the textbook and that from their own contextual experience. So what do? Perhaps you bring in something that's a little more enriching, some kind of digital form of video that speaks well to the subject. So there's more nuances, there's more story, it's contextual learning that allows you to kind of level the playing field and ground everybody within the same context. They go on to an iceberg metaphor for culture, and again, that's kind of that paradigm with picking up on stereotypes, because you only see 1/3 of the individual. All the other stuff that's going on doesn't come out probably in the classroom or in just a general discussion. It's only 1/3 of what's on the surface that you're actually reading as a cultural difference or cultural similarity, honestly. What's hidden underneath the water's surface, though, could be a lot more similarities. So that's why actually trying to have a dialogue, trying to understand, getting histories, getting context from your students is really important to understand the similarities and the potential differences that can enrich the classroom. So a society's culture defines intelligence in that society. All right, so there's the whole issue of language use. So students that obviously are second language learners, they're going to have a marked deficit in being able to get their intelligence expressed across. But there's different values placed on different things within different cultures. So the idea of manipulation of words and numbers in Western society, the example of graceful movement in Bali. So different cultures, different things, different definitive aspects of what defines intelligence. There's a big aspect of social intelligence and mannerisms in Brazil as well, not graceful movement, but mannerisms, prowess in sports, for instance. Health can be a priority, being intelligent about your health. All of these can be a different measure of intelligence that we get away from, that doesn't even fall into Gardner's model of what multiple intelligence can be. So you have to have the realization that if you have an immigrant population that you're serving, they might have different values on different intelligences or different models of intelligence or different things. So they go on to a bunch of case studies here, right? So the idea is we've got all these kids in the same classroom. So how do we best serve these kids? Number one is our behavior has to be baseline to serve them all without preconceptions. So when I worked at Toledo Public, we had a social studies teacher. This was at a high school setting. I had a social studies teacher, and I dealt with a very urban, very poor community at Libby High School. So the Maumee River ran more or less fairly close within the community, albeit in some places through the community. So we had some houses that still had dirt floors, that didn't have concrete or any other floor surface. They actually had dirt floors. And we had one young man whose family was so poor that he actually had to go fishing for his breakfast. Okay, now you have to remember that this is actually in the 2000s, right? So this is actually in the first part of that first decade between 2000 2005, somewhere around there. Okay. So this young man's fishing for his breakfast, cooks up his breakfast, comes to school, doesn't have much clothing. So he comes to school, first class of the day. He goes face to face with the social studies teacher. Social studies teacher says, "Oh my God, you stink like fish. Get out of my classroom." Okay, so without ever trying to understand the context of this child's living arrangements and this child's realities and economics, because of the social studies teacher's expectations and parameters of what a child should look like or smell like in school, that teacher then actively denies services. Um, Not appropriate, not ethical, and by certain means, probably illegal because you're denying services that are public service. So we have to have the realization that we're going to have a wide spectrum, and we need to have the intent to understand behavior and understand the behavior for what it is, that there's a context probably behind it. Cautions on interpreting cultural differences. So most research focuses on only one variable at a time. So like I said before, I can be Latino, I can be Catholic, and I can be American. So if I'm all three of those, and only one is really discussing my performance because I'm Latino and my performance on math tests, it gives a skewed perception of the big mix of me as an individual. And group membership obviously cannot define the individual. So just because they're Latino means absolutely nothing. It means that they are Latino. They're born to Latino parents, or they're born to one Latino parent and they identify as being Latino, right? Or they might identify as being Caucasian or as being African American. It depends on what the mix is and what exposure they've had to that culture over time. Cultural conflicts and capabilities. So cultural differences are often generate conflict. So the whole idea of this dominant culture value is used as a standard for behaviors. Yeah, I can see that if you're in a situation that there are parameters of behavior and parameters of language use that probably the majority of people, independent of whether we're talking about race, ethnicity, or language use, independent of that, since it's the majority, there's the expectations from the majority of confirming or basically conforming to that standard. So when I'm in Brazil, socially I'm different. So for instance, my sense of personal space has to be diminished because you greet everybody with two kisses on, a kiss on each cheek for men and women, so across gender, and women to women, but not men to men, like in France. So you have a cultural expectation there. So if you don't do that, people are saying, well, what's wrong with this guy, or what's wrong with me that this guy doesn't want to approach me? And you have to be comfortable enough with that personal experience, right? With that exchange, you have to make yourself comfortable. So it's different, again, culture by culture, but we have to understand that it's, so if I have a child that's, really close to my face when I'm talking to the child, and that's the child's personal space because the child's Brazilian, then I have to learn to be okay with that. Because the other alternative is I'm trying to assimilate the child into the North American standard of what that's like, which might not be productive with a child's development. So I can definitely meet the child halfway. Compatible cultural differences may generate labels. Okay, so the idea that it's easy to pigeonhole people and stick them into a label, and say all people are going to be like this, like Asian Americans are all going to be the ideal immigrant. But the aspect of your textbook says, they're seen as immigrants multiple generations after the family actually immigrated, which is also a negative perspective. Um, Perhaps if you want to absorb some media on that, an interesting film for you would be Clint Eastwood in Gran Torino, to see what that looks like within that particular community. Dangers in stereotyping. It reinforces conformity, so that means everybody needs to, they believe everybody is going to be the same, and it stifles assertiveness. So it doesn't allow people to break out of the stereotype, or even confirm the stereotype, act stereotypically within that community. So if I'm Brazilian and I'm in an American community and I'm in a meeting and I raise my voice, I might stop from raising my voice because the reality is people are expecting me to be a loud Latino in the room. Let's try again. Perpetuates view of group members as foreigners. Again, it's that whole idea of other. So it's objectifying. They use actually, I think, a video game research, of which if you're not self-identifying in that individual, and you speculate that they're carrying a weapon, you shoot them rather than analyzing to see whether they're holding their wallet or not. Economic and social class differences. So, like I said, I mean, you've got here in the United States, you have a spectrum of wealth, power, and prestige, and there's a nice little table about schooling and what people get involved in. But again, independent of where your students are coming from in social class, they might perform better in school, but they might have parallel issues at the same time, like in Brazil, absentee parents, access to a different class of drug and drug use, access to alcohol in the home. So independent of what they are, kids are still going to be kids. You need to have the realization that all of them are going to come with their own baggage because of their own living experiences, whether they're in social class that's high or low, or prestige that's high or low. SES, we talk about relatives standing in society, so how much power the family has, how much power ultimately the child will be brought up in. Your textbook, though, also talks about the advantages of mixing social class and the expectations of going to college and higher ed. So if we have, say, 80% population that are at a private school, and then 20% of those kids are on waivers within the same community and school, there's more of a likelihood that 20% is going to go off to college because all their peers, if it's an actual integrated school that integrates the two social classes and we don't have cliquism, there's a better percentage chance that they're actually going to go off to college, and that opens up a lot of doors. It also is heavily based on what's going on in that community and the draw of the community as well. Students in poverty, again, they go through a lot of different statistics within the book. So you've got 10% in extreme poverty, over 1 million homeless students. The biggest thing that I can say is about the next bullet. The students who move 3 or more times a year, they're 60% more likely to repeat a grade. This was certainly the case in Toledo Public. We had a huge transient population where students would move within the same district from school district to school district. So all within Toledo Public Schools, which encompassed all of Toledo, they'd move around from one area, one suburb, one area to another. Because they'd end up living with grandparents, or they'd end up moving over here, or they get suspended there, or expelled in one place or another. So there was a lot of mobility, and that mobility did not lead to success. The mobility was ineffective in helping them succeed. 45% of U.S. children live in low-income families or poverty. So guess what? That's a 45% chance you're going to have kids of that makeup in your classroom, or roughly half of your kids are going to come from low-income families. Increasing lower achievement, the longer a child remains in poverty. Why? Because they don't have access to resources. If we talk about literacy, which the textbook talks about, they don't have access to books over the summer. If they don't have access to books over the summer, that puts them at a deficit compared to literacy skills compared to their peers that do have books, do have internet, do have computers, etc., to actually be reading material. My son learned how to read before he ever went to school, because he was already involved in video games when he was 3 years old. So he was already trying to decode what was being written up on the screen and what were the options for him to select in dialogue. So he grew up playing Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic between the age of 3 and 4. So he was more literate going to school than any of his peers. So have your kids play video games. Students in poverty, health, environment, and stress. So negative effects on poverty. So again, this is going to be a little bit repetitive because I just kind of jumped ahead of the script. So poor prenatal care, infant care, etc. Nutrition, high incidence of premature babies associated with cognitive problems. Although you did see in the book that there's a catch-up phase too, in terms of stimulation, early intervention. Exposure to legal and illegal drugs before birth. High stress of evictions, hunger, lack of resources. That certainly is the case. I can say that those are a distractor. More likely to be exposed to environmental toxins associated with neurological impairments. So what are we talking about? We're mostly talking about lead poisoning, because we're living in older homes, or having older cribs that the kids are exposed to, and then we have lead intoxication, which leads to developmental impairment. Student poverty, low expectations, low academic self-concept. So there's negative assumptions that are made often by teachers and other students, because the child dresses poor, they are poor, that they're going to be poor performing in school. Again, the objectives for students have to be the same across all the population. You need to keep your goals, your benchmark for goals, high across the board. Even if that child happens to be struggling with reading, you understand the deficit, and you can cluster the students together by group and give more instruction to that lower achieving group, rather than the autonomous high achieving group, because they can do work autonomously by themselves, right? So that would be the strategy that's implicated there. Negative results such as assumptions, so teachers avoid on calling the poor children in class. Again, I would suggest that they're clustering your work in small groups. I'm a big proponent of what the Little Red Schoolhouse still does today, that you cluster by proficiency or by achievement level, and then you can actually give the lowest achieving group the most amount of time within the room, rather than teaching to the middle. Lower sets of standards. Again, so teachers traditionally, if we look at the research, lower their expectations for performance on students. Really horrible thing. Accept poor work from them and grade it. This was also something that in Toledo Public that replicated out in what we call grade inflation. So if I looked at an A grade from Libby and I compared that to an A grade in the same class from Bowser or Start, which were the high achieving districts, or the high achieving schools, the high schools, then you have the realization that the work is not equivalent. And then if you correlate those to standardized test scores in the specific areas, so the OGT in language arts, for instance, you see that there's a lesser score in my population, in a higher score in the more advantaged population. Okay, so that tells me that A is not equivalent. It's been inflated, and there's It's not equivalent work across the entire district, which should be something that we strive for, to have equal achievement for that A, for that B, for that C, by standard-based grading across the curriculum. Lower expectations lead to low academic self-concept. So, I mean, if I'm being treated lesser, I'm going to have lesser self-concept, which leads again to learned helplessness. We just talked about this in the previous chapter. And then failure to complete high school. So that's why you end up with completion rates that are lower. Peer influence. So middle and high income students of all ethnic groups are more likely to have friends planning to attend college. Okay, so I came from a working class community of mostly Caucasian European immigrants that were first generation or second generation, including Irish, British, and Italian. And all I can tell you is that coming from a community that's a working class community, there's a large spectrum of expectations for finishing high school. So some people plan on finishing high school and working immediately. Some planned on going to community college, of my friends, my peer group. And some planned on attending university. So when you have a large spectrum there, it doesn't become the norm that everybody's attending university, and then you just go with that norm. In this case, it could possibly be seen as a positive pressure given by the peer group, of the fact that if the norm happens to be going to college, then you probably are going to be swayed with the norm and follow along with the pack. That's really the mentality that we're talking about here. So if I have low group of SES mixed together with that high group, then they can kind of raise it up, right? That the expectation becomes a similar expectation. So low SES students are more likely to have friends who drop out. So then if you have that kind of group pressure, then it becomes normalized, right? So once it becomes normalized, it's okay to drop out. If it's normalized that, if in a different culture, if it's normalized to drink, like say in Germany at 16, then that child comes over to the U.S. as an exchange student and doesn't have the realization that they can't drink. The group norm is going to, and the law is going to drive the expectation of the student. Same thing vice versa. If I have an American student that goes over to Germany, they're most likely going to engage in what would be considered underage drinking at 16 because it's legalized. So again, whatever gets normalized becomes kind of what the pack follows along, independent of what pack we're talking about. Greater setbacks from summer breaks. Yeah, we talked about the literacy issue. Begin school 6 months behind in reading skills because we don't have access to materials before they start school, like the video games that I just talked about. May be tracked into low ability or vocational classes. Certainly the case, you're Latino, your second language, we're going to stick you in a vocational class. So you can do that after you've done school. And that's just based on a faulty belief system. That's actually racism. Often attend schools with fewer resources. So, the higher tax bracket, the housing is around the school, the more resources they have. That's just the way it works. Teaching students who live in poverty. Learn about the effects of poverty on student learning. Set and maintain high expectations of the students, develop caring teacher-student relationships with them, build their learning skills, self-regulation skills, pay attention to health problems, absences, tardies, etc. Assess their knowledge. The idea here is we're building rapport, right? Ethnicity and race in teaching and learning. So clarification on terms. So ethnicity is cultural heritage shared by a group of people. So shared history, language, tradition, religion, etc. Race is a socially constructed category of people who share biologically transmitted traits. Traits often based on appearances and ancestry. Minority group, groups of people who have been socially disadvantaged. So kind of oppressed if you want to look at a critical race theory model. not always a numerical minority in the population. So sometimes you can be a minority, but you're actually the majority in the population in that particular area. So, example, where African Americans are the majority, um, they're still classed as a racial minority, which doesn't really make much sense. So, in cities like Chicago or Atlanta, ethnic and racial differences in schools, in school achievement. So there's achievement gap narrows. Achievement gaps narrowing, ethnic groups gaining on standardized test achievements. So things are changing. There's becoming more of a tighter gap, a smaller gap between populations. Greater gaps exist between wealthy and poor students. Again, because of access to resources, I would speculate access to internet, computers, smartphones, literary material, media. This doesn't help us close that gap. And then again, there's a whole bunch of variables that they put in there, and the realization is that students can have multiple variables that they're dealing with at the same time in the gaps, and this leads to not successful completion. All right, so they talk about the law. They talk about Brown versus Board of Education, which is kind of the seminal case that we talk about in educational law that sets the ruling of separate but equal schools, because the African American schools were not equal in terms of resources. But guess what? We still have schools that don't have equal resources all within the same district. So how does that work? So there's kind of a spectrum, right, of resources and who gets what. There's still inequality there, and the idea that segregation became illegal. Okay, so then we have the whole integration that happens between the 60s and the 70s, and a little bit into the 80s still. So. Problems of legally mandating integration. So many whites left integrated schools. Segregation persists in neighborhoods. Neighborhood schools remain segregated because if you have a lot of money and you happen to have a lot of opportunity and you live in the suburbs with a whole bunch of people that look like you, then probably the school and the makeup of the school is all going to look like you and sound like you, and that's the way it perpetuates. So it's also an issue with oppression and income and who has access to opportunities. School district lines often promote segregation, so we'll have a cutoff here where the housing starts to get lower. Racial segregation often means economic segregation. So less chance for opportunities, less chance to earn money, etc. What is prejudice? Well, prejudice is, in your textbook, unfair prejudgment about a group of people. That's why I would encourage you to get out and experience as many different peoples as possible and talk to them. Based on beliefs, emotion, actions, cultural values, can be positive or negative. But they say it's usually negative. Targets race, ethnicity, gender, religion, and other differences. So I didn't know what it was like to be Catholic. I wasn't raised Catholic. I didn't know what it was like to be Catholic until I actually attended Mass for the first time. And at first glance for me, a superficial glance was there was a lot of standing and a lot of kneeling. So at the age of 15, I wasn't thoroughly enamored with the idea of being Catholic. And eventually I became something else, and then I eventually married a Brazilian Catholic and decided to raise my children Catholic. But Brazilian Catholics, perhaps different in being in Brazil than being Roman Catholic in the States or in Canada. So again, there's kind of a misrepresentation or a misperception on my part of what it was like to be Catholic. Um, Also, the fact that I was raised amongst Irish Protestants. So there was a lot of negative talk about the Catholic community from a lot of close Irish friends because it was still a hugely volatile issue between Northern and Southern Ireland, including the whole issue with the IRA and all of the bombings and everything else that was going on. So again, when you're exposed to a lot of negative talk from your peer group, that influences on your perception of who you're going to become over time. So we also have racial prejudice, so racism, so discrimination and bias. Pervasive, so it's not always in your face, right? And it's not just confined to any single group. It still exists. They say it's declined in recent years. It still exists. Development of prejudice starts at an early age. So personal, social, and societal factors contribute, like I just talked about being Catholic. Human tendency towards us, them, or in group, out of group. So again, it's the danger becomes when you start to objectify another class of people. So Catholics versus Protestants. That whole versus aspect becomes, well, they're not quite as human as me. So then I don't need to respect them, and that's an inappropriate cognition to have. Just because there's a difference does not mean lesser. They're not synonymous. Stereotypes, so that's what we believe, know, or feel, or think we know, or feel about a group. Prejudice prompts stereotyping. Again, all of us try to make sense of our world. So stereotyping is a way that cognitively we try to make sense of our world, that it's okay for these people to behave this way because it's part of who they are. Okay? So in that case, it's actually a very positive thing, but the realization is you need to dig a little deeper to see all the similarities between you and the other people. Continuing discrimination. Discrimination involves acting on one's beliefs or feelings of prejudice. So it manifests as unequal, unfair treatment towards categories of people. Continues towards Native Americans, also First Nations Canadians, African Americans, Latinos in the U.S. Education system. My wife, Dr. Abreu Ellis, she actually did her master's thesis on the number of children in special education services in Southwest Ontario. So is the number of kids that are Native Canadian or First Nation Canadians that are in special education services. So the incidence is incredibly high compared to, say, their Caucasian peers. Teachers need to recognize their own prejudice. This course you should see as a catalyst. So independent of where you are in your career, whether you're seeking initial licensure, whether you're seeking a master's degree, or whether you're auditing this class as an elective for your PhD, in a discussion of what critical race theory could be like, the realization is it's good to try to self-analyze. It's good to try to push the limits of your own comfort to try to be the best possible professional and best possible you that you can be. And that could cause you discomfort, and that discomfort's okay. So we avoid all discrimination, even unintentional acts, even self-taught talk, even talk at home when you're alone, even shouting in the car at somebody that cuts you off. So we try to cut out all the gender slurs, all the race slurs, all of those out of your vocabulary, and the self-monitoring becomes the issue for you. You value each student, guarding against marginalizing any, and you increase sensitivity to each student's needs. Stereotype threat is kind of a unique social effect in the idea that if you're from a group of people or a culture, you fear that your performance may confirm the stereotype to others. So you haven't been socialized to this yet, but I don't think I've informed you, but I'm Canadian. I'm born from the west side of Toronto, from Etobicoke, just like so many other people that work and live in the States. Now, the natural comedy relief is your belief that I'm going to say an EH, an A, at the end of the sentence every sentence that I make. A long time ago, any possible utterance of that was purged from my vocabulary because that would confirm the stereotype linguistically that somehow I had this mechanism, or I had something that identifies me as being Canadian, although I am very proud to be Canadian. But in Canada, we see that as actually a lesser mechanism. We see that as an unintelligent filler in language. So we have our own self-stigmas based on our own culture, based on our own regionality as well. So that's why we have to be really aware of how people change their behavior not to meet the stereotype, because people can be putting a lot of energy, students can be putting a lot of energy into trying to avoid looking good at math if they're a young lady when they happen to be really good at math. And sometimes that manifests subconsciously. So they're causing a state of anxiety within themselves because, wait, I'm a girl, I'm not supposed to be good at math. Or I'm a Canadian and I'm supposed to say A, so I'm not going to say A at the end of every sentence. So a lot of people put a lot of time and energy into their own self-monitoring in doing that. That takes away from curriculum delivery. Now imagine a safe environment that everybody feels like they can be themselves without being belittled. That's an ideal environment. So, because every time, or at least half of the time that I say to somebody that I'm Canadian who's not familiar with me, they will start into, oh, you're Canadian, eh? You hoser? And then that gets my back up, and then I do not want to socialize with that person. I do not want to give them the opportunity to socialize with me. They're forward. So stereotypes in school, they prevent students from performing at their best because, again, it's a cognitive load issue. They're worrying about how they look, and they're worrying about living up to a role. And it interferes with attention, learning the subject, and decreases the connections to and value of that subject. And it likely contributes to the achievement gap. Effects of the stereotype threat, short-term effects, so poor performance on tests and other things. Lower math performance, example, lower math performance for women and African Americans when stereotype threat is present. So what your book explains to you is you need to say this, this textbook or this test, it is not, it takes no effect of gender into consideration, it takes no effect of race into consideration, so it takes the pressure off. So possible explanations, performance avoidance goals, so you're trying to avoid looking dumb. That interferes with the use of effective strategies. That's just that's just an anxiety disorder waiting to happen, basically. Reduction in working memory capacity under stress. So the more stress you have, there's a good level of stress. We get to a certain point in stress when it tips down and it becomes unproductive towards our cognitive capacities. Long-term effects, we have disidentification. So we feel disconnected, less motivated, withdrawn, don't want to get involved. I gave you the example. Basically, somebody who puts the A in front of me, I'm just going to walk away from, wash my hands at them, and never deal with them again. Combating strategies, helping students believe intelligence can be improved. Gender in teaching and learning. So we talk about gender traits, behaviors, We also talked in the textbook about the classical male-female roles in terms of the sense of self. I hate to tell you, but these things still perpetuate over time. So, um, I've been married for 25 years almost. I, I have a very diverse set of interests, and I have always had a huge, diverse set of interests. So I go to extremes. I ride a motorcycle, but I also sewed my wife's wedding dress. Okay, so that gender role, though, right? The fact that I can sew and made her wedding dress 25 years ago is incongruent for a lot of people in the fact that I'm male and heterosexual. So the realization is that even if that's brought up today, and even if it's brought up with the next generation of 18 to 22-year-olds, so many people are surprised by the fact that I have that skill set in my repertoire because I'm a male. Sex, in terms of definition, we're talking about biological differences. Sexual identity, though, on the other hand, is how you actually identify, so your beliefs about gender. Stages of development of sexual orientation identity. So they give you kind of a scripted feeling different, feeling confused, accepted. I have many former students, many colleagues that are part of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community. And the reality is there's no standard of development, but there is development. So when it happens, it happens. Some know soon and some know later. But you need to be ready to embrace that within schools and have the realization that the first time a kid makes a comment in class that's demeaning to another kid, you need to keep the bully in check. Because it's not productive to anybody's learning environments to infringe on that and marginalize somebody else within the classroom. So teachers need to listen, affirm, reach out. You don't need to be an expert. You have a guidance counselor in the building or that you share between buildings. You don't need to be an expert to help the student understand their identity. So you can refer them to an expert. But like the textbook says, you need to squelch the harassers and you keep checking on that student. Not impulsive or obsessively, but you need to chime in to make sure every student's okay. Gender roles. Don't know quite what happened to the PowerPoint here. So, again, we talk about the idea of schema-based theories, so beliefs about males and females. That's what I was trying to describe previously. Gender schema theory, so they're organized into themes, classifications. So, clothes, so boys don't wear skirts unless they're Scottish and they're wearing a kilt. Games that are played, so the boys play the boisterous, loud games. The girls not so much. Although I do have an oral history of in 1930 in Milton Township, the girls and the boys played integrated softball together in one-room schools. So again, not everything's totally definitive in the way that we see history and the way that we see things. Toys, behaviors, so I'm not allowed to play with a Barbie. Behaviors, careers, right for boys and girls. So the whole idea is, and we're going to actually get into this because I'm going to have you watch some media on the idea of both careers and the idea on race and stereotypes. But that's yet to come. Ideas about gender are more stereotyped in young children, so preschool and the early years, they actually have even more stereotyped behaviors. So, again, girls are playing with dolls and pushing shopping carts, and boys are building on a construction set or mechano set. So a lot of this has to do with how we socialize children to play even before they start school and what expectations there are in roles. Gender bias in curriculum materials. Okay, so you have to kind of look at the media that you use in class. You have to kind of read the textbook. So if boys are always being portrayed in one role, in the textbook, and girls are always being portrayed in another, and the media equivalent, so the pictures that are going on there are that way, then you have a problem. Okay? Gender bias. So there's a lot of studies out there about gender bias over the decades in teaching. So consistently, boys receive more attention, both positive and negative. High achieving girls receive the least amount of attention, and 90% of the elementary teachers are females. Boy, is that correct. I see that in teacher ed almost all the time. More male teachers are needed, they say, to identify. Well, I was a male teacher, and it's good to have a mix, I guess. But I also believe that when we make statements like more male teachers are needed, more African American teachers are needed, more Caucasian teachers are needed. How about more good teachers are needed? How about that one? No gender-specific teaching strategies. Good teaching is effective for all students. The goal is successful learning for everyone. No boy-specific, girl-specific teaching strategies. Oh my goodness, no. Guidelines to identify gender bias. So like I said, check the textbooks and what are prescribed or sourced teaching materials you're going to use. Be vigilant about your own comments in the way that you address things, like he works construction, she works in a shop. I mean, probably not the best examples. Avoid limiting options for male-female students in any class. So the girls go here, the boys go here. You guys are going to be dealing with sports, the girls are going to be dealing with shopping. Again, not appropriate. You want to blend both of those to do that kind of cognitive muscle confusion that I was talking about previously. Use gender-free language. So instead of he, she, they, provide non-stereotypical male-female role models. I just talked about that. And provide opportunities for all students to do complex technical work. So then we go on to talk about multicultural and creating cultural compatible classrooms. And they give you kind of a prescriptive idea of what that would look like. All right, so content integration, knowledge construction processing, prejudice, empowering school culture. There's a lot of big words, a lot of big ideas there. Here's what I can tell you to do. Okay, I can tell you to do is, if you know a little of another language, mix in another language. If you are comfortable with reading a book in another language or bringing in materials that were written in another country that have been translated to English in terms of storytelling, research studies, etc., bring them in. It doesn't need to be American-centric in everything. You can validate other cultures by validating their knowledge. Another aspect is allowing students to share their stories. So if they're from another culture, the goal is not to assimilate them as being American. The goal is to celebrate their other culture in the context of being American. That's kind of the equity in pedagogy that we're striving for. So again, a little prescription here. So teaching that rests on three propositions. So students must experience academic success. That's all students. All students must experience success. So if they're not succeeding, you need to find a way to get them to succeed. Must develop, maintain their cultural competence. So they have to be able to walk in both worlds if they're immigrants. Right? They have to be able to walk in both worlds if they were brought up in two different cultures. They have to be allowed that space to do so. Again, goal is not assimilation, it's celebration. Must develop critical consciousness, so challenge the status quo. So critique whatever social norms are there that produce the inequities. So change it up. 3 steps for teaching students of color. Believe in the children. How about we do that for all children? Believe in all children are capable. Connect to students' lives. Conversations are great. Sitting down with kids at lunch, even better. Watching them play sports and giving them a pep talk afterwards, whether they succeeded or failed, really good idea to build rapport. Know your students. So you only know them if you actually dialogue with them or dialogue with their parents, right? So that's communication's key. Okay, so then we go on in the textbook on what's considered a resilient student. I'm going to stop here. I'm actually going to have you watch a little TED Talk on the idea, the nature of grit. So resilience and grit kind of are synonymous in their definition. So we'll look at grit and how we build grit, but at the same time, you have to be aware that grit can come at a little bit of a cost because not all students can handle that model. So the innocuous stress nature, because the more you're exposed to stress gradually over time, the more you can handle it, is the idea. So we can talk about that a little bit further. Building family and community, we talk about partnering with parents. Communication is certainly key. Parent volunteer opportunities at the school. Learning at home, so suggesting ways for families to help their children learn. Involving parents in school decisions. Funny enough, curriculum used to be kind of a community-based decision on what students were reading and what students were developing in terms of importance. So if you go back in the 19th century, the community's developing curriculum before it becomes a state-prescribed curriculum. And there's guidelines that come out in the 1880s to prescribe curriculum. Integrated community resources, so you tap into the community resources to try to get everybody together, all the stakeholders on the same page. Diversity and learning, so social organizations, you want to make sure that you actually have a good mix, and that doesn't always mean that it's not a non-segregated group, right? So the Latino students might want to hang out together, and that's okay, and speak Spanish. Or the Brazilian students might want to cluster together and speak Portuguese. So you just have to have the realization that there's going to be great variation over time. And then they go with this cultural profile model. Yep, I did this when back in 2000, when I was doing multicultural counseling. Okay, so again, it's not a one-size-fits-all. So they believe Latinos are more family-oriented, okay, and loyal. But not all Latinos are family-oriented and loyal. African Americans, have the reasoning by inference. But again, it's not all. Native Americans learn privately through trial and error. Asians are independent, learn collectively. I hate to tell you, but natives also make collective decision making because of the traditional tribal structure. And I have friends that are Anishinaabe. So, and I participated in Native culture in Ontario. So the realization is when somebody wants to make a decision, they go and consult with everybody else. So it's there's overlap, and we can't have one size fits all. So and do question the nature of learning styles research. I do prescribe that you do multiple sensory inputs. You cover all the bases, but that doesn't mean that that you need to include all of Gardner's stuff in every lesson plan. Yeah, so, we have to be aware of language and language use and the fact that not all people use language the same way, okay? So, where some people might interrupt conversations to get their opinion across, that could be coming from the home environment, where one parent consistently interrupts the other parent, and that becomes modeling of behavior, so the child sees that behavior and thinks that that's the norm. So really, if we're talking about this chapter, a lot of it has to do with normalization, right? So what the child brings to school as normal because of other experience, we have to adapt to and understand and make it work as a potential strength, because that child's going to have a lot to say, but you might need to impose a behavioral strategy for the child, so we raise our hand before we talk. Okay, we've done that consistently over time in schooling. We can also demonstrate appropriate behavior. We do this in adaptive physical education, so like a hand-over-hand technique. We can do the same thing with words. So what's appropriate word choice? What's appropriate in terms of when I can express my opinion, etc. So clear classroom rules that that you don't sway on, that you keep your behavior consistent in enforcing those rules, will lead to an orderly classroom and a productive classroom and space for everybody to speak. Okay, so lessons for teachers. So this is a grand summary. Know your students, learn their backgrounds, work with parents, respect your students, accept their strengths, limitations, build their self-images, all their self-images, which can include not just respecting, but embracing their culture. Teach your students, so hold high expectations and provide caring support, focus on meaning and understanding, balance routine skills with novel and complex activities, and provide context for skill learning, making it relevant, influence attitudes, beliefs about academic content, which means, yeah, we're going to learn today. It's exciting. Thank you for listening to my lecture.